joining us in the Saturday evening. I hope you guys are doing great and staying safe. My name is Rashmi. I am a community manager at Recro, wherein I'm building a developers community wherein we connect like-minded people, and you can be a part of Recro Tech Circle as well. We talk about a lot of stuff, new technology, events, and if you sort of face any challenge in the tech space or any projects you're doing and you are struggling with that, you can take the help from the community. Those who are joining us for the first time and those who don't know what Recro is and what do we do, it's basically a developer focused platform which is helping developers connect with fast growing startups such as PureFit, Udan, Swiggy, Dunzo, etc. So if you happen to be someone who is exploring and looking out, you might want to head over to the careers page of Recro and you should find something for yourself. So that's what we do, right? And again, thank you so much for joining us for Recro Talks. Today, we are going to talk about front-end tooling for distributed development. So today, we have Abhinav Rastogi with us. A quick intro about him. He is currently building cutting-edge enterprise web apps at harness.io for making software delivery easy for everyone. Before this, he led the PWA revolution at Flipkart. Thank you so much, Abhinav, for joining us. And it's a pleasure having you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rashmi. It's really good to be here. Good to be part of this webinar today. And yeah, like Rashmi mentioned, I'm working with Harness right now, and I will go into a little more details in a minute. And yeah, really excited to be here today. And we'll be talking about some interesting topics that are close to my heart and working around tools and processes, how we have seen Harness scale over some period of time.
So yeah, Abhinav, let's get started.
Cool. All right. So welcome everyone. And like we mentioned, today we'll be talking about the idea of different tools and processes that work for us at Harness in the UI team. And generally, I want to talk about ideas for better developer experience and better developer productivity in a growing team. Right. Like I mentioned, my name is Abhinav Rastogi, and I work at a company called Harness. Our website is harness.io. So a quick intro about me. So I'm a UI architect at Harness, and I've been here for around 2.5 years now. And like Rashmi mentioned, before this, I was leading the UI team at Flipkart, where again, we worked on some interesting front-end technologies. Personally, I'm passionate about a lot of things apart from UI, also including things like driving, photography, gaming. And if you want to talk about anything related to this presentation around this topic or any UI technology or any of these topics, feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me on Twitter. My handle is there on the screen, or you can email me, which is also on the screen. Like I mentioned, I work at Harness, and to give you a little more context about, this is where this presentation is coming from, like our entire journey and, our processes, how they develop. Harness is a modern software delivery platform where we try to use AI to simplify many DevOps processes. We offer a lot of products in various forms, including things like continuous integration, continuous delivery, cloud cost management, feature flags, and many more. Right. Again, to set a little more context for this presentation, within Harness, we have seen over 3 times growth in the engineering team in the last 2 years. That's including the pandemic time when everyone started, we went into a remote first kind of a environment. And since then, since we have grown in that remote first time, right, we have become a highly distributed team, which required us to have new processes and new tools in place to ensure that we are still able to work together seamlessly. It just Slack and email don't cut it, right? You need to have processes in place which help solve the common problems that come with a distributed team, right? So that's what I will be talking about today. And that's the problem statement that I want to focus on, right? So how do you improve developer experience while maintaining or improving code quality, while tackling certain challenges specifically from the UI team's perspective? Some of the learnings will be applicable across different kinds of teams, but I will be focusing a lot on my experiences with the UI team, right? And for this problem statement, the main challenges that we have seen at Harness have been, it's an expanding product. We have a very strong product roadmap. We are adding a lot of new features, very quickly. And that means that whatever we build, right, whatever processes we have, they need to scale, not just in terms of performance, they also need to scale in terms of product, in terms of features. When you add new features, the platform you build needs to be able to handle, new challenges and new sort of requirements that come up every day, right? The other challenge is a growing team. Like I mentioned, we have grown very fast in the past few years, right? So that means we again have to have these kind of tooling, that kind of tooling in place, so that as we onboard new people, as we get new people, we are able to scale that properly, so that we don't have any dilution of culture and dilution of quality for our code. And apart from that, obviously the biggest challenge in the past 1 year has been remote development. We have all sort of learned, we have set our own personal processes on how these things work, but we also need processes to coordinate better, like I mentioned. So working on these, talking about these principles specifically, I want to start talking about what is developer experience. So if you're saying we're trying to improve developer experience, what is it, right? So if you check online, mostly the definitions about developer experience break it down into three main categories. Any kind of, when you talk about experience of software, right, or any kind of a process or tool, you usually talk about the first experience that someone has with that entity, the first success they have it with it, and the last touch that they have with it, right? Now, this could apply to a lot of things. For example, this could also apply to user experience, right? Or UX, that we say, UI, UX. So for example, for UX, this will apply the first experience is what a user sees for the first time that they see your product. Let's say they open your website. First success would be when they're actually able to use your product, use your website to achieve something. For example, if it's an e-commerce website, the first time you open the page, that's your first experience. When you buy something, that's your first success. And your last touch would be when you actually get your order delivered, and that's when that transaction ends, right? Specifically for developer experience, how you can sort of tailor the same terms to developer experience would be, you can talk about the first touch would be your onboarding for a new developer in your team. The first success would be that developer being able to develop something new in your team. And the last touch would be that the developer has ready reference to any kind of a problem that they have on any kind of processes or tools or code or any kind of components you have. All of that needs to be readily referenceable, right? So that's what a developer experience can be broken down into. So again, just to reiterate, we are going to talk about onboarding, development, and reference for developers. Quickly jumping into, let's start with onboarding, right? So onboarding is especially hard in a remote environment, right? We would have seen, we have a lot of people have changed jobs in the last 1 year, and they would know very well that like onboarding was anyway hard. Like when you move from one company to another, you have to learn new tools, new processes, you have a new code base, a new product to learn. There's a lot of things to learn, right? And it becomes even harder in a remote environment, right? And the idea is we need to make things easy for new team members, right? We need to make that onboarding process as pleasant and as easy as possible. And what we have seen from our experience is, for setting up a new onboarding process or setting up the onboarding process for your company, walkthroughs for us have worked the best. By walkthroughs, I mean that in the remote first culture today, for walkthroughs, you need to get on a call with them, let it be a Zoom call, like, some kind of a video call, talk to them face to face, right? And actually show them, walk them through the product or the process or the code, actually show them that this is how things work for us. So that gives them a lot more relatability to what they're going to face on a day-to-day basis in the new job, right? If walkthroughs are not possible, let's say you do walk through 1 or 2 times and you're not able to scale it for any reason in your team, recordings is the next best option. Record one of those walkthroughs, because usually in walkthroughs we see a lot of Q&A happens, right? You get a lot of back and forth questions from the new dev, from the new joinee, and at that point, if you're recording this, usually those questions tend to be your frequently asked questions. Usually you will have a lot of common confusions and common steps that need to be done. So having a recording of that session can be very useful if you cannot do a custom walkthrough for every new joinee. And if that's also not possible, right, if you have not recorded something yet, documentation is the next best bet, right? So you need to have good documentation on, again, all of these things, on what tools you use, what processes you use, right? How do you commit code? How do you deploy code? Who do you talk to if something goes wrong, right? All of these things need to be well documented and easily referenceable at any point of time. And of course, all of this is better than doing nothing, right? So you should have some kind of an onboarding process that's critical. And just to reiterate, at least have a documentation. Even better is have recordings, and even better is do live walkthroughs for new joinees. Talking about documentation a little bit, right? Documentation is also hard, right? Having good documentation, we all say that, yes, it's good to have documentation, but who's actually going to write it? Right. So obviously your processes and all you have to document. If there's no shortcuts to it, you have to, at some point, you just have to sit down and write down that this is how things work in our company. But when it comes to the code, right? For a new developer in your team to understand your code, or even an experienced developer, right? Someone old in your company, they would not have experienced the entirety of the code base. So if they come across some code they have not seen before, right? It's good to have documentation, but it's hard to write new documentation, right? So the solution for that is, at least for the code base side of things, try to have a self-documenting code base, right? What I mean by self-documenting code base is using technologies like TypeScript, JSDoc, Storybook, right? These are all examples on how you can have a code base that is sort of self-explanatory, right? So to give you a little more detailed example, let's say you have a JavaScript code base, right? Since we're talking about UI, your JavaScript code base usually tends to be a little hard to read, right? Even if you add comments, that's very good if you're writing comments. But even then, the code actually, whenever a new person is reading your code, right, they need to sort of reverse engineer what is happening in their minds, right? They're trying to figure out, okay, this is what the developer was thinking. This is what happens here. Is this parameter optional? What happens if I pass a wrong value? Right? Like, think of it like from a quality perspective, right? Like, you could pass any kind of values to anything, right? And that's where something like TypeScript helps. If you see on the left side, that for a function of our component, if you define props and interfaces, types for those things, right? Now, this itself, like TypeScript works as a documentation, sort of, right? That okay, this function will take only 3 parameters, out of which, let's say, page size is the required parameter, the others are optional, and what are the types. The TypeScript itself is your first layer of documentation, right? It makes it easier to understand code. The next level would be that, if you combine TypeScript with JSDocs. So JSDocs, if someone doesn't know, it's a very well-defined standard format of writing documentation, and a lot of automation tools understand the JSDoc format, right? It's a specification, and even your IDE will support auto-completing JSDoc comments, right? So I will come to that in a little bit when we talk about IDEs. But generally, if you add JSDocs comments, this is what they look like. You actually add a description of what each parameter is supposed to do. What does it mean, right? So, like, for example, your page size is the number of items per page. Here, it seems obvious by page size, but you would be surprised on how confusing it can get when you have similarly named parameters like what is page index, what is page size, and those kind of things. So it's very helpful to have these kind of comments in place, right? And JSDocs also defines very nice schemas for defining parameters, and what is the return value of a function, what are the parameters of a function, what does each parameter do for that function. So all of that is very well defined in that schema. And like I mentioned, your IDE can auto-complete all of this for you. Going one step ahead of this, right? So all of this is still happening in your code, right? Now, let's say if you talk specifically about, since we're talking about UI, right? You can add the idea of Storybook on top of it. So if someone doesn't know, Storybook is a JavaScript sort of a utility or a library built by Facebook, which allows you to render components and render the documentation, right? And it generates the whole UI for it. And that's sort of self-documenting code for you, right? And this allows you to actually create a website and host it. And this is super useful. You have a playground for your component where your developers can actually play with it. And if you have TypeScript and JSDocs in place, right, Storybook will actually pick all of that automatically and generate all of this documentation for you, right? So Storybook is generating all of this UI. This is zero code written from the developer side. You just build your component and you just add Storybook to it, and that's all. Like it generates all of this for you, right? And you can actually change these values at runtime and see how will it impact your component, right? So this has been super useful for us, having all of this combined, and having this documentation in place of how how do you integrate all of this, what is the format for all of this. And we have seen a lot of improvements in a lot of reduction in sort of frequently asked questions on, do we have a component which does this? What should this component look like? All of these things get handled by Storybook. You have a ready reference of all the components that you have, and you have ready documentation for everything. All of this without actually writing any documentation, right? Like, this is just code that you're anyway writing, right? And you get a full-fledged UI out of it, which works really well for us. Moving forward, continuing on the same theme of making things easy for developers, the obvious idea is, the more you reduce the overhead, the more quality you can get out of your code base. The more quality you will have in your code base. By overheads, I mean any kind of extra processes or extra things that developers need to do to figure things out or make things work, right? So I will give you an example. Okay, for example, the code structure that you have on how you structure your code, how files are maintained, how you get how you arrange your code base makes a huge difference on how a new developer will understand what is happening in the code base. It will also impact experienced developers and how much effort there is in, let's say, adding something new or moving a file or deleting a file, finding references for it, writing tests. Everything gets impacted by the way your code base is structured, right? And by that I mean the literal file structure and the directory structure that you have for your code base. So we experimented with a lot of things around this, and I will show you an example of, I will talk about what worked really well for us, right? And we have used this across multiple repositories in both backend and frontend, right? So the idea that I'm talking about is the concept of code layering. Okay. So what we do here is essentially within your code base where your actual UI code lives or any kind of code lives, you start creating layers, right? By defining folders, right? And layers are essentially just containers for independent features or products. So you get independent features that are unit features in themselves, and that becomes one sort of layer, right? Or you can have just logical separation, right? And all of the layers are essentially numbered, right? So you need the numbering helps in a lot of things, right? So the first benefit of numbering is that you are not restricted to alphabetical order of folders by default, right? So you get this numerical order, which guarantees that your code base always looks the same in the same order, and that also helps you to add, like, this is the most important part of code layering, that higher number layers always build on top of lower number layers, right? So to explain this with a little more example, right? So if you see on the left, this is a screenshot from our repository, from a demo repository. And what we are doing here is the lowest layer, which is the lowest number, is your common components like buttons and tables and things like that, right? Like basically your UI design language kind of components. Okay? The second layer on top of, so your common layer does not depend on anything else, right? Like those common components are just those standalone components. On top of that, for example, you build your access control layer. Okay. Your access control layer would be any kind of product features that you need for access control, any utility functions, all of that. On top of that, we have a layer called for projects and orgs. Projects and orgs are common concepts in a lot of products, right? But when you use projects and orgs for a customer, you need access control. Do you have the permission to create a project or not? Right? So projects and orgs is in a new layer on top of it, right? And that's the idea. Access control is in such a low layer because everything else in the product will need access control, right? It's like a platform concept. Right? Then on top of that, for example, we have a concept of pipelines. It's an internal term, but let's say these are some common components that are used at Harness. And then on top of that, we have the products like I talked about earlier. We have a cloud cost management, the continuous delivery product, continuous integration product, right? So all of these are separate modules, which internally use the common concept of pipelines, right? So you have your continuous integration pipeline, CD pipeline, right? All of this pipelines internally use projects internally use access control, and then all of that internally uses your common components like buttons, right? Now, the benefit that you get here is that one, you get an acyclic dependency graph, right? So essentially, you will never have loops within these modules, right? Because you can only import, like, for example, CD here can only import from lower modules. Access control will never import components from CD, right? So we don't allow that. So what that ensures is that you have an acyclic dependency graph. So when you talk about bundling using any kind of a tool like Webpack or Rollup or anything, the bundle output that you get can be optimized further. Your build time is faster. And if you decide to do, bundle splitting, code chunking, micro front ends, any of those concepts, it's very simple to just move one of these folders out to a separate repo and, just load it independently if needed. Right. The other benefit we have seen from this as a side effect is that you get more ownership, right? You can do a lot of things when you have code structured like this, right? So what is happening here is, for example, you can have if you have separate teams for any of these, for example, if you have a platform team, right, or a authentication team or something like that, right? They can keep ownership of access control, right? And you can have different rules for different folders. You can have different, for example, code coverage rules. That common components should have a lot of code coverage, basically unit tests, because these are common and they need to work perfectly all the time, right? Versus you could have more strict controls over who is allowed to commit changes to access control. Right, because access control is a security sensitive area. So it's better to have limited number of people making changes there. Right. And I will talk more about how you do these kind of things. How do you restrict access to certain folders and all? But essentially the layering concept, that you have different layers and certain folders can only import from other folders. This can be implemented using the ESLint rule of no restricted imports. Right. It's pretty straightforward. If anyone needs help, if you want to set it up and you need help, you can reach out to me or you can just Google it. This works really well. And this has helped us a lot. And like I mentioned, a lot of things, right? Everything from our bundling to actually ownership, right? So this concept has worked really well for us, and this has helped, again, for new developers, for generally everyone in the team. This makes it very easy for people to just quickly see, where things are, how they work, who talks to, who imports from who. It's just very straightforward to understand the code base. Moving on, a common thing that pretty much every product will have is some code to make API calls. Right. And usually that service code is what I'm calling it. Usually that code will look something like this. You have a function which takes some parameters, which internally calls an API, which uses those parameters in certain manner. Right. And then it processes the data that you get from the API and it returns that data. Right. And now in your UI components, you can call this function instead of calling the API directly. So you have at least one level of abstraction. Right. You can have other levels of abstraction on top of this. For example, you can have other higher order functions which handle, let's say, API failures in a common layer, so that every service function doesn't have to separately handle it. Right. So this is a good idea. So at least keep your service code separate from your UI components. However, we faced a lot of challenges with this kind of programming when we scaled, when we added new products and when we added more people. We sort of started facing some issues, right? So the common issues here were that, one, when you write this kind of a code, you are essentially hard coding manual contract validations with the APIs, right? So here you are assuming that the project's API takes an org parameter and then it returns data in a certain format, right? So that is something you have assumed. It may be true today, but it may not be true tomorrow. And if the backend API changes, right, your clients will fail, like it will be a runtime failure, right? It's also hard to maintain or update. Like I mentioned, if the API changes, then someone has to go and manually make changes in this code base. And you have to test it, deploy it, all of that. So it's hard to do that. It's easy to leak business logic into this, and that's an issue we had, that you're writing JavaScript here, you have the API response available here. It's very easy to just say, okay, maybe let me just iterate over this array, convert it to a map, and return the map instead, right? That it will be more optimized for people to consume a map instead of an array, right? So let's say you do that, right? So now you have some business logic, sort of some logic encoded into your service code, right? But now that reduces the reusability of this function. Let's say someone needs that array of projects, right? What do? Either if they make changes here, then the existing code will break, who was using this function. That means they will need to actually either make a copy of this function, and the other copy will call the same API, but now it will return an array, or you will add a parameter to this function. Do you want an array or an object as in return? And you will conditionally return a different type, which again makes it even harder to maintain, right? And of course, there is no type safety here, right? Even if you're writing this in TypeScript, if you're manually writing it, it's easy to skip types, right? TypeScript will a lot of times assume types, or by default, it will go to implicit any. So you're essentially not getting type safety with this kind of program. Right? So we actually faced all of these issues, when we started writing code like this. So what we figured out was that you can even automate this, right? So like I talked about self-documenting code base, we also have like a self-generating service code, right? So there are a lot of tools which allow you to do this. For example, Swagger, CodeGen, RESTful React. I have links here. I will share the presentation after the after the webinar, so you can access all of these links. But the idea is that you can automate all of this code generation very easily using some simple tools, right? So the idea there is, so let's say you have your API implementation on the backend, right? So let's say you have a Java API, right, which looks something like this. So you implement a class which internally implements certain functions and types, right? Which and other nested classes. So you have some backend implementation in some language, doesn't have to be Java, right? You use the idea of Swagger or Open APIs, right? So it was called Swagger up to version 2, and from version 3 onwards, it's called Open API. It is basically a specification, which is sort of a standard way to define an API's request and response structure, right? It's a very useful tool. It basically allows you to define that schema in either a JSON or a YAML format. And what you get is essentially, from this kind of code, OpenAPI will automatically generate this kind of a JSON schema, where it tells you that, okay, if you have a endpoint called /permissions, a get call on that endpoint will take these parameters, and then it will also tell you what will be the response type of that, right? And again, it will tell you the exact parameters that you will get in the response, right? As you can imagine, if you have all of this data, right, it's not very hard to generate TypeScript interfaces automatically from this kind of data, right? How that code generation works is another topic in detail. But like I mentioned, there are a lot of tools which do this for you out of the box. OpenAPI has its own code generators, or you can use other third-party tools specifically for the kind of client that you're building. For example, if you're building a React client, right, then you can use something like RESTful React. And again, there are multiple tools which do this, which will actually generate React code from the TypeScript interface or from the OpenAPI spec, right? And now, as you can see, with one command or one script, you can actually go from Java code to React code automatically, right? And the benefits of this are multifold, right? So obviously you get automated API contract validations, right? So if your API changes at any point of time, you can automate that code generation, and your front-end service code will also automatically generate. And now, since this is being written in TypeScript, you automatically get end-to-end contract validations between backend and frontend, right? Super helpful. And this has really improved our code quality a lot. Right, like I cannot emphasize how many issues can be avoided just by having strongly typed contract validations between backend and frontend. Right, that's where TypeScript shines the most, and this has really benefited us a lot. Right, the other obvious benefit, like I mentioned here, is it's essentially a zero effort update and maintenance. There's just one command you need to run; it will auto generate everything, all the code. So you're literally only building the UI. All the code to actually make the API calls is being auto generated. Right, so it's zero effort, right? And like I mentioned, you get guaranteed type safety from all of this, right? Which is a really big benefit, especially in a growing team, right? So this is a very interesting topic, and there's a lot of nuances and complexities to this that come in. For more details, I have added a link here to a talk given by one of my teammates earlier. So again, once I share this, you can view that talk, and you can, like, that talk specifically talks about just code generation from end to end, right? How to get end-to-end type safety. Cool. Moving on, again, we were talking about making things easy for developers, right? So the idea is IDE integrations reduce overhead, so you should use that as much as possible. Apart from the obvious ones like TypeScript, ESLint, and all of those things, you have a lot of cool extensions available on all the app stores, right? So for example, if you're using VS Code, right, which is what I use a lot, for example, there's a Jest Runner extension, right? And I have the link here, which actually allows you to run your Jest tests from your code directly. So you get these little annotations on top of your test cases. You can just click on run and it will run that test case and give you the output there itself. Right, it's super easy. You don't have to, for example, go and find that test case and say, npm jest something and then find the file name and all of that. There are extensions again to allow running your npm scripts and updating dependencies. So this really speeds up a lot of the common things for which you might be sort of thinking about what command do I need to run. Right, same thing applies to Git. There's a lot of extensions for all IDEs which really simplify Git integration for your code base, and it's also pretty easy to write custom extensions. Right. One thing that helped us a lot, specifically because our team uses VS Code a lot of people in our team use VS Code. We found out that VS Code has this concept of workspace recommended extension. So if you go to the App Store or the marketplace in VS Code, you will see that they have an idea of recommended extensions, which is the extensions recommended by VS Code. And then there's a concept of workspace recommended extensions, which is basically extensions used within your team, right? So in your code base, you can actually add this kind of a config to your VS Code config file, right? There's a JSON file where you store your VS Code config. You can actually add this, and for all the developers in your team, whoever clones that code base, VS Code will actually recommend these extensions to them so that they install it, right? So for example, this was really helpful for us to make sure that everyone is actually running things like Prettier and ESLint in their IDE itself. right? Instead of trying to run it on the command line and missing some files, and then it gets caught later and things like that. So this was really helpful for us. The other thing is your IDE can actually auto fix a lot of issues. I've seen many people don't realize that your IDE is not only showing you the error. Most of the IDEs, including WebStorm, VS Code, can actually fix those things. Those features actually come from the underlying libraries, right? So usually you have this option of quick fix. If you click on this, it will give you options. Or another pro tip, you can just hit command dot in VS Code on a Mac, and it will just immediately auto fix that issue for you. So if it's basic things like import orders, missing import spelling, your IDE will auto complete all of those things for you, right? So it just speeds up your workflow a lot. So for the obvious things. So that was about developer onboarding and things like that. So let's say now your developer is onboarded and they've started developing, they are writing code, they're committing code, right? Let's talk a little bit about code reviews, right? So the idea there is what we have seen has helped us is you need to look at code reviews like golf, and the aim is to play in the minimum amount of golf, right? Similarly, the aim with code review should be that you need to minimize the amount of code you need to review, right? So how do you do that, right? So one idea is the concept of pre-commit hooks, which is a core concept of Git, right? So Git basically supports running custom scripts or any kind of checks. When you run the command git commit of any file, you can register a script that will run automatically before that, and you can add that code in your repository, and it will run for any commit that happens in your repo, right? But instead of adding custom scripts and manual scripts, again, there are other tools to help you make it easier. For example, there's a really popular and useful tool called Husky, which actually allows you to run different checks on different file types, right? So how we use this is that we run a lot of static analysis on your local machine on a pre-commit hook even before you push things to GitHub, right? So all the common issues, obvious things, like spelling mistakes or missing imports and those kind of things will actually you will not be even able to commit those changes, right? Your CLI will tell you immediately that this is missing. So your turnaround time improves a lot. You don't have to raise a pull request and then later find out in a code review that, oh, you made this small mistake, right? So it takes seconds instead of hours to fix these things then, right? And also you can prevent changes to certain files at commit time. So an example of this would be something like, if you have a Webpack config in which you are changing, let's say, where your API calls are getting targeted, or let's say you're changing where the source maps are enabled, right? You don't want anyone, like people will make changes to that file to, maybe they want source maps in local, but not in production. They make that change, and by mistake, if someone commits that, then your production builds get impacted, right? So for example, you can prevent changes to these kind of files at commit time itself, right? So this is an example, output from the script when we run on our code base, when we try to commit something. It will run all of these checks and it will tell you if everything is good or not. And it hardly takes 1 or 2 seconds, right? Because these are all static checks. Cool. Moving on, again, talking more about code reviews, the idea for developers should be to review the design and not the syntax, right? This is a very important fact that, bots are better at reviewing syntax. Humans are better at reviewing design, right? So let the bots review the syntax, right? So again, a screenshot from our repository, when we make a pull request, we have 11, 12 checks that run on it automatically for every commit, which will just go and check everything from your types to, code style to code quality. We have custom scripts to check some standards that we want to maintain, certain patterns that we want to maintain. All of those things can be automated. They should not be left to a person to find out these kind of issues in your pull request, right? However, what you should review is the design, right? So the idea is that code reviewers should also be considered owners of that code. It's not just the person who wrote it, right? Reviewers should also be owners. So they need to understand exactly what is happening in this code, why you made the decisions you made. And again, to optimize that, you should prefer small pull requests. That part is sort of obvious. I think everyone knows the smaller the PR, the better the code reviews are. And if the pull request is larger, one process that has worked well for us is that if your pull request is anything over, let's say 500 or 600 lines of code, right? It's better to schedule a time with the reviewer, the person that you want to review your code, schedule a time with them, sit with them on a call and walk them through your code, right? That has helped us a lot in the reviewer actually, because when your pull request gets large, right, people just start looking at syntax. And you would have seen that meme that, when it's 5 lines of code, then the reviewers will find 5 issues in it. But if it's 500 lines, they will just let it go that, okay, it looks good to me, right? That's because the reviewers are not spending enough time to understand that design. So it's better to organize a walkthrough for that, right? Cool. The next thing I want to talk about is, some sort of, again, a few tips that we have seen. This applies not just to UI, but any kind of a repository, for all kinds of users. GitHub has some really cool features that are sort of hidden away in their settings, right? So, and those settings are hidden only for the admin users. So if you know about these, you can talk to, if you have admin access, you should enable them. If not, you should talk to the administrators of your team to enable these kind of features. They're super helpful, right? So I will go over a few of them one by one, right? So for example, the first useful feature in GitHub is the concept of code owners. So I mentioned this earlier that you can restrict who can access, who can commit to what file, right? So basically, if you add this file called code owners, right, in all caps, in the root of your GitHub repository, this is what the file content looks like. You give a file name or a folder path, and you give a team name or an email ID of a user, like the GitHub user ID, right, or a team name in GitHub, right? And what that does is GitHub understands this file internally. And when you raise a pull request, which contains any of these files, so let's say if I touch the .github file or folder, or if I make a change, let's say if I add a new dependency, right, in package.json, GitHub will automatically tag everyone in the UI console team to add reviews on that, and your pull request will be blocked until someone from this team reviews it, right? So for example, I have a screenshot from a pull request which touched a common file or touched multiple files from multiple modules, multiple layers, like I showed you earlier. And GitHub automatically tagged 3 different teams on that pull request that someone has touched some code in your team, so you should review it. Right. Again, this has helped us a lot in making sure that, for example, this happens frequently if you change a common component. If someone changes the design of a button, for instance, right, that's going to impact entire user interface, right? You would want every single team to at least check that it's not breaking anything in my area, right? So this is a super useful feature, and again, you don't need anyone's permission to enable this in terms of, authorization. But you can add this code owners file in a repo, and you get this feature for free in GitHub. The next very useful thing in GitHub pull request reviews, especially, is there is this little gear icon above the files, and in that, if you enable this feature, hide whitespace changes, right? You apply and reload a pull request or a code diff, which looks like that these 4 lines were removed and these 6 lines were added. Right. And then you have to mentally parse that, okay, these 4 lines look same as these 4 lines, and it looks like only one if condition was added. Basically, this was just an indentation change, right? So in this demo PR, you will see that, if you ignore whitespace changes, then GitHub can intelligently figure out that even if the indentation has changed, then these lines are actually the same, even if the line numbers are different. GitHub is able to figure these things out automatically, and it will actually just show you the real changes that happen. Right. So especially for a bigger pull request, let's say if you have 500 lines of pull request, 500 lines of change in a PR, hiding whitespace changes can bring it out significantly, right? Because you don't need to review indentation changes. You are just worried about, okay, what is this if condition that was added in this PR, right? So this is also super helpful for reviewing larger PRs. You can focus on what actually changed instead of trying to figure out what happened. The next item is, again, so now this one is for admins only, but you have this concept of branch protection rules. So there's a long list of features or checks that GitHub can run on any pull request. For example, you can disallow commits directly to your master branch or your main branch, right? Whatever is you can configure this rule per branch. So on any given branch, you can say, don't allow direct commits. You have to create a pull request. Okay. Now that you have a pull request, you can ensure that that pull request needs to have approvals. You need to have code reviews on it. It should not be allowed that you can just create a pull request and merge it yourself without showing it to anyone, right? And you can also say how many approvals are required before merging, right? In Harness, we use minimum 2 required approvals on any code change. So this ensures that, at least 2 pairs of eyes are looking at any piece of code change that goes in. So this has again helped us in improving a lot of our quality. Similarly, there are a lot of other settings like, let's say someone approves a pull request and then you push another code change, right? Should that pull request still be considered approved or should it require a new approval, right? So this is what this line item is for. You can dismiss tail pull request approvals when new commits are pushed. Again, this ensures safety that, that you are getting approval for one change and then sneakily you are pushing in some other change and automatically getting it merged. It avoids that. Similarly, this is how you enable code owners. Once you add that file, the code owners file that I showed you, you need to mark this as required review from code owners, and GitHub will start automatically tagging people on that, right? On a pull request. And you can, there's a long list of features when you open the screen. I won't go into all of them, but these are super helpful for ensuring quality, via code commits. Another very handy feature that would be useful for a lot of people if you're using something like Jira, for issue tracking. One thing we follow is that we, put Jira IDs in our commit messages, right? So anywhere you mention a Jira ID, right? So for example, here PL is our project name, a platform project, and 19960 is the ID of that ticket. What you can do is in the GitHub settings for a repository, you can add, there is a setting for auto link references, right? And you can add this rule that if you see the text PL-123 anywhere, translate it to this hyperlink. So your Jira URL or whatever, whatever tool you use, Trello, Asana, whatever it is, translate this text to this URL, right? And GitHub will automatically find for any commit, any, like any kind of any issue that is created, any, comment that is created. If someone mentions anything in this format, it will automatically get linked to that URL that you created. So what this has done for us is, whenever I'm looking at, okay, I see a code change that, Bugsnag setup was added in the Docker file. This is the pull request. But if I want to find out, okay, why was this done or what was the, product requirement for this, the ticket is right there, right? I don't need to go to the pull request or talk to the owner of the pull request. Why did you make this change? Your tickets are automatically linked, right? Super helpful. And last but not the least, there is a really cool feature in GitHub called pull request templates. This also works for issue templates. But the idea is that you can add a template file in your .github folder, which essentially, like it's a markdown file. And it's very simple. GitHub will basically pre-populate your, like when you're creating a new pull request, you have to fill this, comment section, right? That what is this pull request about? GitHub will pre-populate that with the template. For example, this is what our template looks like in Harness. We sort of prompt all the developers that you need to fill in the summary, the Jira links for that change that you're making, some screenshots for that change. That's sort of something as a process, we push everyone to add screenshots if your change has any UI changes. And we also add some common sort of commands that you can run for the GitHub bots for the checks that I showed you earlier. For example, you can re-trigger our jest test cases just by commenting re-trigger jest. So all of this is here so that someone doesn't need to remember that what was the command, how do you run it, right? And this also sort of prompts people and it standardizes the format. So pull request templates have also been super useful for us. You can also sort of auto tag people in this. So for example, if you want to tag someone or notify someone for every pull request that's created, maybe it's a bot or you want to trigger some action somewhere, right? Some automation, you can do all of that via pull request template. Super powerful feature. Cool. So that's all I had today. A lot of small things that we have done, over the last 1.5 years. And, we have seen a lot of improvements in our quality. And the core idea is that all of these things have come up from a process of iteration. So we enable some things, then we get some feedback from the team. Did it work for you? Did it not work for you? We take that feedback, we iterate again, we make some more changes. And that's how we define new and better processes, right? So it keeps improving. Right. Yeah. So that's all the content I had. I think we can open up for questions now. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Cool. All right. So I think Ankit is asking, don't you think JSDoc increases the size of the code? Screen asset is important. How much we can see in one screen is really important. And 16 by 10, I think screen ratios are becoming more popular for the same reason over 16 by 9. I think that's very fair. Definitely, I mean, if you add more comments, yes, your code size, like the visual code size, what you see on the screen will definitely increase. But I like you anyway cannot guarantee what screen resolution all of your developers are using. So anyway, everyone is seeing different content, right? Everyone has different zoom levels. So personally, I think optimizing the space that your code is taking physically on the screen is not a very like that's not something you can standardize easily or optimize easily. Definitely, if it's a concern, then you can also put single line comments if that's a concern. But generally, for this on the screen itself, anyway people will scroll. Like you have code files for 500 600 lines of code, then anyway they have to scroll that much. So a few comments will not make it so much more worse. Again, there are IDE tools which can auto collapse your JS doc comments. So if you're worried about that, you can add that plugin and it will hide all the comments until you need to see those comments, right? So that could be one solution for the screen asset size problem. So Suyash says, okay, thanks for the great session. Thank you. I'm glad you liked it. As a fresher in front-end development, what are the important things one should focus on other than JS and frameworks? That's a really good question, Suyash. Thanks for asking. All right, so as a fresher in UI, what are the important things apart from JS and frameworks? I would say the important things would be the idea of design, like code design, that what, like you can have two different, like, you can use a framework within React. There are good ways to write React applications. There are bad ways to write React applications, right? Like React does not solve all of your problems magically. Similar, like that applies to all frameworks and all programming languages, right? So personally, one thing that I find very useful is don't restrict yourself to just JS and its frameworks, right? Don't restrict yourself to even just UI. Gather knowledge from as many sources as possible. Even if you're watching some live telecast of how SpaceX is launching their rockets, I mean, you can learn something from that, right? Like there's knowledge everywhere, so keep learning. And especially for UI development, I would say, there's a lot of great resources out there. There's a lot of free courses out there. Watch more talks on YouTube. Again, I would say it's about the principles, design principles that become really important for growth. Right. So at some point, you need to start understanding what kind of a coding pattern or style scales better, not just for performance, but for teams, and how to write code that's more understandable and more bug free. Right. So, for example, a lot of times it's better to write longer code instead of short, fancy shortcuts to do something. It's better to actually just elaborate exactly what you're trying to do, so that if someone else is reading your code, that's better, right? So learning these kind of concepts takes time, and I think that's what is important, other than just learning the language itself. Okay, so Sujit asks, do we have any best practices for commit messages validation in Harness? Definitely, we have some set of rules that we follow. For example, one thing we enforce is whether that change that you're making, that commit, is a feature or a bug fix or a chore or a refactor, right? So adding this helps the reviewer and our automation bots to understand, and a quality team, when they see the change log, it helps them understand that what is the kind of impact you're looking at. So if it's a feature, that the product team should be involved. If it's a refactor, the quality team should be involved, right? Those kind of things. The other thing we enforce is, for example, a Jira ticket ID should be mentioned in the commit itself. Again, that helps in tracking, for any commit, any change that was made. It helps us in tracking back at any point if there's an issue, or for someone to understand why was this commit made. It helps to have that Jira ID in there, right? And then you can have any number of rules on top of it, like message length or some other message, sentence case or lowercase, those kind of things. We don't enforce anything like that today, but those are the two things we mostly add. That for a commit message, you should have the type of commit it is and a Jira ticket ID. Cool. Then there's an anonymous question: is all these tools or check make developer experience good or make bottleneck or blocker? That's a very interesting and a very good question, I would say. You always tread a fine line between, so you don't want to cause too much friction for the developers. But the idea is, let me take an example, right? So for example, I talked about pre-commit hooks, right? And a lot of times they seem like extra friction, right? But the idea is the pre-commit hooks are not doing anything new. Those checks would have anyway run on the pull request, right? You, like any code commit that you make, it should have, like, it should be run through Prettier. It should be run through, like, lint check should pass, type check should pass. You should be able to build that code, right? Those things are not optional. So you actually get an extra benefit by running it as a pre-commit hook, because like I said, your turnaround time reduces significantly. You don't have to wait for creating a pull request to check all of that. And anyway, pre-commit hooks, for example, can be skipped by the developer. Let's say if you know that it's a temporary commit or it's a work in progress, you can skip those checks at the time and it will anyway run in the next commit. Right? So definitely, I think that's a very good point. We should ensure that, again, right, the idea is to improve the productivity and experience for all the developers in the team. So we have to keep that in mind at all points. Right. And again, like I mentioned, this is an iterative process. Let's say you introduce something like, first of all, if you think that it's going to add friction, talk to the team before you add something like this. And secondly, if someone gives feedback after adding it, it's important to take that feedback and try to iterate over it. That can be improved, can be reduce the friction, can be, continue to make the experience good instead of adding a bottleneck. Cool. All right. Then Yagnesh mentions, can you share some good sources you refer that we can refer? I'm not sure what about exactly sources for. If you can clarify, that would be helpful. But generally, I would say there are a lot of resources. There's a lot of free courses on, let's say, for example, egghead.io has a lot of free courses on the basic tooling that you use today for UI development. Things like Webpack, React Router, React. There are free courses on all of those things and really phenomenal quality courses. There's also frontendmasters.com. I think that's a paid course, but that's also pretty good. There are a lot of tools. There are hundreds of courses on Udemy. So if you want to get some sort of a semi-formal education in this, there are many sort of structured courses available. Apart from that, I would say for you can find a lot of people from these kind of webinars, conferences. Follow them on Twitter or wherever you can follow them. Listen to them talk, listen to them what they're talking about, and look at open source code, like any popular open source code repository. Like if you just open React, or if the React code, or if you open any of the popular tools, right? Look at their code base and you can learn a lot from how they do things, because these are typically, the popular tools are that popular for a reason, because they're performant, they're well structured, and especially in open source, that the code structure is good and the process are good, because thousands of people remotely without any onboarding are able to contribute to them. So open source repositories are a very good source for learning how to build a good project. Cool. Then an anonymous question, any tips to crack a job as a front-end developer, good product companies? Harness is hiring. If you want to apply, you can reach out to me. And I think Rashmi has also shared a Recro link. There's a lot of good product companies. And for cracking a job interview, I would say, again, be good at basics. There is not really a lot to cracking a job interview. You just need to be able to you should have good problem solving skills, good coding skills. And again, basics is what are mostly needed, unless it's a very specialized job that you're applying for. Mostly just the basics are enough. What is the best code structure for React project? I would say there's no such thing as the best code structure. Depends on your team, depends on your requirements, depends on your project. But like I mentioned, the example that I gave has worked very well for us, considering, again, like I said, it depends on a lot of things. Like it depends on the product you are building. So in our use case, the example that I gave in Harness, like I mentioned, we are building many independent products like CD, CI, cloud cost management, feature flags, all of these, right? They are all independent products. They all have independent UI teams, but it is still a monolith repository. So how do you structure code in that manner, right? That's where code layering helped us a lot. However, if you have a singular product and you have your own repository, the code structure will be slightly different for that. If you need tips on something specific, again, reach out to me. I would be happy to have a discussion on that. Upcoming events by Recro, I think, Rashmi, you can probably shed more light on that.
Yeah, I have shared the links of our social media platforms in the chat. So guys, you can follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn, and as and when a new webinar is coming up, we sort of announce our webinars on social media. So yeah, follow us there and you shall be updated about that.
Okay, then another anonymous question. Do you have any suggestions on how to manage React components across large teams? Cool, thank you. That's an interesting question. So for managing specifically React components, one thing that has worked for us is, one, we have moved the components to a separate, just purely the components to a separate repository. That's not critical or required, but that has helped us in a number of ways. Basically, we can have different checks and balances on those components. The other thing that has helped us is the concept of pure components or pure, functional programming. So that's an entire topic in itself, on the idea of pure functional programming. But the basic concept is that any code that you write, your functions or your components should not have any side effects, right? So as long as your components are pure in the sense that they take some props or parameters and they return some value, and for the same properties, for the same parameters passed, they return the same output. That makes it a pure function. Basically, it doesn't talk to global or anything like that, any global state. That is a very important factor in maintaining reusable components, right? And again, for across large teams, documentation is super important, and especially having visual documentation like Storybook has also worked very well for us. Because we have teams distributed across like 6 different time zones, in Europe, US, India. The code author of that component is not always available to answer any questions. So having good documentation is super important to make sure that no one is blocked on someone else, right? And again, like there's a lot of ways to do this, but yeah, these are a few that come to my mind. Cool. Then we have a question from Sheikh. Please recommend some books for an experienced front-end developer. 3 years of experience learning Core.js fundamentals are generally not covered by the tutorials. Some books. Okay, interesting. Books for Core.js fundamentals. So there are some good books. I have a few here. Anyway, so there are some good books. So obviously there is the old one called JavaScript, The Good Parts. That's really nice for your Core.js fundamentals. There is also, there is a really good book called You Don't Know JS. That's super helpful. And it actually has many different versions for different parts of JS. Yeah, exactly. The You Don't Know JS from Kyle. Eloquent JS is also a good one. And I'm sure others can also recommend a lot more. Personally, these are the ones that I've read. There are also a lot of books on React, but frankly, for these kind of frameworks and tools, hands-on experience is the best. There's not so much you can learn from a book apart from the theory of it. You have to learn how to actually implement things. So following an online tutorial and building your own application. I will tell you a sort of a hack, not a hack, but something that I do. Let's say if you use some common application like Reddit or Hacker News or Facebook or anything like that, right? Personally, I prefer Reddit or Hacker News. They have public APIs that you can talk to. Even GitHub has a public API. There are a lot of public APIs out there. Just pick one so that you are familiar with that API. And then any language or framework that you are trying to learn, try to build the same application again and again, just using different frameworks. So if today you are learning React with React Router, let's say, or Redux, then you implement your Reddit API using Redux. Then tomorrow, if you're learning, let's say, RESTful React or Redux Saga, right? You make changes in the same code base, or you again implement the same API, the same application, but using something new. So that gives you a lot of learning on just how that specific framework is working. Cool. Then another question is, thanks for the awesome pro tips. You're welcome. Can you help? How do you actually get to this full pipeline? Can you maybe share a few more framework names which can help build such effective pipelines? I'm guessing you're talking about automation like continuous integration pipelines, like pull request checks. In that case, there is a lot of tools out there, both free and paid. Harness itself is one, like that's the business we are in. There's also a free community edition, so you can set up a CI pipeline very easily. You can set up a free account and set up all of these automations for a pull request. Internally, how that works for any CI tool that you use online, whether it be Circle CI, Travis CI, or Jenkins, anything. The core concept is the concept of GitHub webhooks. So you can read up more about that. Webhooks are essentially the way of how GitHub or any SCM provider, essentially, it's like a pub sub system, right? So GitHub will, raise events, public events on whenever certain event happens, let's say new code commit happens or a new pull request is created, and all of these CI tools can essentially listen on that event and run their automation whenever that event gets triggered. Cool. You're told to keep learning and not just focus on JS framework sources for that. Like everything is a source for that. Any kind of like you can learn from anything. Like personally, like I mentioned, any interest that you have, right? Like I'm also interested in, let's say, game development. Then if you're learning game development, that learning transfers over to UI development, like I would say 50-60% of the times, right? So anything you're learning, it doesn't have to be just programming in one specific technology. anything you're learning, even if you're learning backend, how to code APIs, or, how to code web servers, reverse proxies, all of that applies to front end, right? Like, for example, if you learn how caching works, right? Or if you learn how message queues work, right? All of that is applicable to the JS community, because let's say you have service workers, which is like a network, is a programmable network proxy on the front end, right? You have IndexedDB, which works like MySQL on the front end. So if you're learning how SQL queries work, you're also learning how IndexedDB works in the browser, right? So learning transfers, a lot of the times you just have to make those connections, that I'm learning, how do I apply it to what I already know. But yeah, sorry, I don't have any specific sources for it. But yeah, I mean, maybe I will try to find some and share on Twitter or something. But yeah, you just have to keep searching. How can one turn into senior front-end developer from a junior developer in terms of technology? Interesting. Specifically in terms of technology, I would say, again, the same thing. Don't focus too much on just front-end UI. Like, don't just restrict yourself to learning only React and only, just one kind of JavaScript framework or library. Learn other languages, right? Learn other things, that will help you grow. It doesn't mean you have to become, let's say, for example, if you learn iOS programming, iOS application development, right? Doesn't mean you have to become professionally an iOS developer. But from there, you can learn a lot of things, that how do different languages work? How do different data structures work? Different languages have different data structures implemented, right? So everything is a source of information and knowledge. And that helps you sort of figure out, okay, that in some languages, there are more optimized way of doing something, but in JavaScript, there's a different way of doing it. So that itself gives you a lot of knowledge, that tomorrow, if you're talking to someone else, or, you're talking to a backend developer, that I need this API, in your company, you can have a more one-to-one conversation around, okay, this is what you can change, this is what you can do. All of those things apply. And that's what I think, sort of turns you from a junior developer into a senior developer, apart from technology. The whole idea of how applications are designed and, how actual problems are solved. So it's not just about coding a UI, it's about building applications and building products out of it, right? So another important thing that reminds me is learn product development. Like, learn what product managers do, talk to the product managers in your company. I'm pretty sure 99% of them would be happy to share product knowledge with you, right? Learn product management, and that will itself give you so much edge on whether a design looks good or not, whether customers will like it or not, right? So it's just those kind of things, just learn everything. It's good to continue learning. Cool. Then another question is, what is the best JS pattern to keep the base of the app strong? Does Harness use a lot of class-based posts, or can we achieve good patterns with just functional? Interesting question. I would say don't restrict to any single pattern. In Harness, we are pretty happy with just purely functional implementation 90% of the times. But within that functional code base, it depends on the use case. In some cases where like specific parts of the problem, for example, just as a random example, right? Like within your entire product, the idea of access control works very well with classes, because you have the whole idea of object orientedness, where you can have roles deriving. You can have one class to represent a role, and then you can have other roles deriving from that. And like, it depends on that specific use case. So your entire application can be functional, and then within that, your one feature can be classical in nature. So you have to sort of mix and match these things, right? But personally, I mean, I have not seen any sort of repercussions of, especially if you talk about React, then functional React has solved all of our problems. We have never run into an issue where we could not do something efficiently with functional React that we could do with component-based classes earlier, right? So that has been, that has not been an issue for us. What are the things that we need to consider for performance optimization? Oh, performance is a pet topic of mine, and I can talk about hours for that. But instead of talking about it here, I would probably I will share some links to I have spoken a lot about performance. I've given a lot of talks about performance optimization. I'll probably share some of them. But I think the core principle, if everything boils down to one sentence, is iterations. So you have to basically validate your application, run benchmarks on it, and then iterate, improve the benchmarks. test your application again, run benchmarks again, and then continue improving. Right, that's the goal. How you actually do that, I will share some links. There's like it's a deep network of so many things you can do at different layers. Which one should be preferred between Redux and React hooks? Depends on you, depends on the team, what everyone is comfortable with. Specifically, I would say if you are already using React hooks, the whole feature of Redux, of the concept of having reducers and sort of what do you call it, declaring events and everything, all of that, there are existing hooks available in the core React library. So you can just say use reducer and you get the half the functionality of Redux right there. So if you're already using hooks, there is not too much benefit of Redux. But again, like I mentioned, if you have a specific use case where Redux works well for you, I mean, Redux is not a very heavy library. So it's, you can just include it and you should be good. All right. But again, like I mentioned, personally, like we are not using Redux right now in Harness, and we have not seen, like mostly for state management, we use the React context itself based on React hooks. And we have not seen any repercussions of this making that decision. What makes React more popular than Angular? Is it good to learn both and become a good UI dev? Thanks for the question. There are many factors. I mean, when you say React more popular than Angular, I think that's debatable based on what, like objectively, I don't know if you're comparing the stars on GitHub or what, but there is a lot of Angular developers also who are learning purely Angular. It's still being maintained. It's still being used very heavily. Again, it depends on your use case. Like Angular has some very good features like, two-way binding, two-way data binding that React does not do. They're architecturally very different, but they have been getting similar and similar over time. Is it good to learn both to become a good UI dev? I would say you should pick one and be a master of it. Like in today's day and age, majority of UI development is done either in React or Angular, right? So even if you learn, like if you're a master of one of them, right? Like learn, let's say for example, if you pick React, right? Just an example, be really good at it so that, you can solve any problem that you face with React, but it is still good to at least know, like I mentioned, like all knowledge is good. You should at least learn what Angular is, how it works, and have a basic idea of how things work, right? You don't have to be super good at it, like any one of them, right? This also works vice versa. Like you can be a master at Angular, but still learn how React works, again, because the principles are a little different, and you can actually, in some use cases, one of them is better, in some use cases, the other is better, but you can actually implement the same design principles in both the frameworks, right? So again, you can mix and match things. Like don't mix the actual libraries, but the patterns you can match. Like you can implement two-way data binding in React manually. So if you have a use case for some part of your product which requires two-way data binding, like some real-time update system, then you can implement that, right? And if you have learned Angular, then you would know how it works. So it's easier to implement it in React itself. Have you tried to explore Web3 till now? No, I haven't. I'm not sure what Web3 is. Okay, I'm not sure. I will need to check. What kind of projects will be good to have on resume to get it shortlisted and Harness for a fresher front-end role? Share your resume with me, I will let you know. But yeah, any kind of, like, I don't know, share your resume and I can let you know. Have you used Svelte? What's your opinion about it? Yes, I have worked with Svelte. It's really good. And again, I think it has a certain use cases where it shines really well. I would say it works really, really well for, and this is my personal opinion, right? And I could be wrong, but it works really well for slightly like a more read heavy pages, like, and less write heavy. So what I mean is, if you don't need too much user interactivity in the terms of data input, so for, I can take an example, right? So in my previous company in Flipkart, it would have been a very good fit because as an e-commerce site, mostly like for the browsing part, at least, if you forget about checkout and all, the browsing part is mostly just read heavy, that you make an API call, you get some data and you render a page, right? Svelte is super powerful at that. And it's really optimized to do those kind of things. And you ship minimal JS to the client. right? And again, if you have requirements like search engine, like you need SEO, right? And you need server rendered pages, React is very heavy for it. Things like Svelte or Gatsby JS for static sites are super powerful for it. However, if you have, now, for example, if I look at my current applications, right, Harness, it's a very data intensive, a very user input intensive application where we have a lot of forms, a lot of data, a lot of, charts and graphs and, those kind of things. Svelte still works, but then you have to spend more time to sort of make it work the way you want it. Right? So depends on your use case. So again, it's useful to learn what Svelte is, how it works, and that will help you figure out where should you use it, where you shouldn't use it. Cool. Then another question is, if I'm building an application in vanilla JS, HTML, CSS, and want to create a dynamic DOM elements, and I'm doing so using inner HTML, is it always bad to use it because of security concerns, or is there a rule of it using it properly? Dynamic DOM elements using inner HTML. Okay. Also, if not, then is manually creating DOM nodes and appending them to parent. Yes, I would say setting inner HTML is a security concern, especially if there is any user input or like query parameters or anything like that. So let's say if you're taking anything from the query params or from a input field or anything like that, and you are processing it somehow and then putting it in inner HTML, that's risky, because that, like, if someone puts a script tag there, it will actually get executed. That's how you get XSS and CSRF issues. Creating DOM nodes and appending them is usually the best practice. But even when you're doing that, it's still easy to run into XSS. So I would say, if you're not using, so for example, React and Angular have their built-in sanitizing, right? So if you render anything, it gets sanitized by React automatically. Most rendering libraries do that. But if you're writing vanilla JS, I would say it pays to add like a small utility. You can write on your own, or you can you can add a dependency. They're usually very small, simple dependencies that will sanitize your DOM input. So it's useful to do that even if you're using a DOM nodes manually. But usually, creating DOM nodes is better than, I would say, using inner HTML to set anything. Cool. Then the next question is, what are the steps to ensure maximum code maintainability? It's sort of a big question. I think for code maintainability, a lot of the things that I just showed will apply. You need to make sure you have these automation checks in place, these processes in place, because a lot of the times you should have seen that concept, right? Or that meme that if something is already dirty, then people don't think twice about making it more dirty. People will just throw trash. If there's a pile of trash, someone will just throw more there. But if you're, if some area is clean, someone will think twice before they drop an empty water bottle there, right? It's the same concept. You have to continuously make sure that your code base is clean and maintained properly. Once you have some issues in there, right? For example, adding warnings has not worked very well for us, right? I mean, you have 1,000 warnings today, you will have 1,005, 1,010, 2,000 warnings 2 months down the line, right? It doesn't really matter too much. No one cares much about it. So you have to make sure that you have proper checks in place, and it's okay to add a little friction if it objectively gets you more quality, right? So automation is very important for ensuring code maintainability also, and having good processes. Cool. And I think the last question is, what are your thoughts on micro frontends? Interesting. So micro frontend is something that I'm actually working on right now at Harness. I think so. Micro frontends is more of a buzzword. It doesn't mean any one thing by itself. It's more of a concept. But the concept is really useful. So specifically, again, it depends on your use case. If you are, like, for example, for us, how it applies is, like I mentioned, we have these independent products, right? Like Harness is one single sort of application for the end user, but within that, we have independent modules of products like, continuous delivery, continuous integration, called cloud cost management. So for us, it works very well for these to be micro frontends, right? Because we can have customers who are using both CI/CD, or we can have customers who are using only CD. So we would want them to be as modular as possible, separate micro frontends that we can stitch together at runtime. And if a user wants all of them, they get all of them. If they want only one, then they're not wasting bandwidth and resources to sort of download and run all the other modules, right? So I think micro frontends have their place. Definitely a very good concept. But they have the same pitfalls that you have, let's say, in microservices, right? You have this whole extra overhead of maintaining, like the whole communication between them and maintaining that layer that talks to all of them. So you have to make sure that the cost of that overhead is outweighed by the benefits you get from actually implementing micro frontends, right? Like there's no point doing micro frontends if it is anyway just one single application, right? And you have no product reason, or there's no actual reason to split it, then the overhead of maintaining that is probably not worth it in that case. Cool. Okay, I see a few more questions. A question from Suraj. When you start a new application, should we go with frameworks which are already known by your developers at your firm, or should we go with the latest framework in the market? Both frameworks satisfies all your needs for the project. Cool. Thanks, Suraj, and good to see here at this webinar. Okay, so when you start a new application, should we go with framework which is already known by your developers at your firm? Okay. Interesting question. I think the question you need to ask here is basically the product requirements and the timeline. If you're starting a new application and your go-to-market time is like, let's say, you need a POC first, do that POC in whatever technology you want, that's good. But end of the day, if 10 people have to work on it, all 10 people, or at least the majority of the people, need to be comfortable with your choice of framework. So it should not be one person's decision. Again, I think it needs to be a unanimous decision from the team that this is what we want to use. And usually what I've seen works best in this scenario is have a proper document and, like just start noting down, as you evaluate frameworks, note down pros and cons for all of them, including things like the size of the framework, performance, note down the common requirements of the product that, okay, we will need to build these features, or these are the requirements. Will these frameworks X, Y, and Z be able to solve those, right? And once you build that kind of a matrix, right? First, you will easily see that, okay, this framework is meeting my requirements. This one is meeting half of the requirements. So, you automatically have some kind of an answer there. The other factor is, let's say if you have a singular product, usually you wouldn't want to ship two different frameworks in the same product, because that performance cost will need to be paid by a customer, right? And performance, I've said this a lot of times before, like performance is like a critical feature of your product. A slow product, even if it's useful, if it's slow, people will not use it that much, right? So you have to keep in mind that, let's say if you're using some framework like React today, and tomorrow you decide, okay, I will build a new feature in Angular, like shipping both React and Angular is too much cost. It will just slow down your application, even if it speeds up your development, right? So you have to consider a lot of things, right? Thanks for the question. As a beginner, can I use, so Sudhagar asked, as a beginner, can I use TypeScript in React? Yeah, 100%. You should, in fact. And like the example I gave you, I mean, React works beautifully with TypeScript. React comes with all the types. It has its own type declarations. There's also the definitely typed library, which has all the types for React. And it works really well. So your whole concept of prop types, you have interfaces for the components, it just works really, really well. So yeah, definitely you should use TypeScript in React. And yeah, and like beginners can do it. You just need to understand individually how React works and TypeScript works. They work well together. Cool. Then an anonymous question is, what are the steps for better error handling? Any particular library or tool you would suggest? I've heard something called Sentry. Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of tools. They are less about error handling, like Sentry, Bugsnag. There's a lot of them. They are mostly for error logging and error tracking. They don't actually handle your errors. So for handling the errors, I would say, start at the lowest level in your tree. So if think about your DOM tree or your component tree, right? One, you should try to handle the error where it happens. So if your API call fails, capture it there and show a message to the user, right? And now that depends on your product, whether it needs to fail silently or not. But try to capture the error at the deepest possible place. And then if it needs to bubble up, right, at some point you can add, React has the concept of app error boundary. You can look that up. And that allows you to capture React or, UI errors and show a general error page if something goes catastrophically wrong. Like, so if you run into like an uncaught exception at a page level, then you can have an app error boundary wrapping your entire application so that you at least don't end up with a blank page and an error in the console, right? So you can use app error boundaries. And then beyond that, you should definitely use one of these two, like Sentry or Bugsnag, and there are other tools, you can use those also. They just log the errors to a server. So because what is happening is when the error happens on the client side, usually, a customer will refresh the page or something, but they will also get frustrated. right? That why did break. So you want to capture those errors somewhere. So you need to send it to some server so that you can track what are the common issues our customers are facing in terms of JS errors, and then you can rectify those, right? So Sentry and Bugsnag are two that I've personally used, and they both work really well. So you can use any of them, right? But good question. How much DS? Okay, so Sheikh asks, how much DS algo is required for software engineer and senior software engineer UI position in Harness? Very specific question. DS algo is generally quite important. Like specifically at Harness, I think, we don't specifically ask you like only algorithm questions. Like personally, I feel that's not a very useful metric that, like if you can inverse a binary tree or something like that. I don't know. I mean, that's not something you do on a day-to-day basis in a UI role. But having said that, like data structures and algorithms are still very important, but in a real world scenario. So usually at Harness, we talk more about, real world problems. Internally, to solve that problem, you might need to, let's say, reverse a tree or something, reverse a list or something. I don't know. But usually, we talk about real world problems and how you would solve them, right? So you can have multiple solutions for any of those problems. If you're not comfortable with, some data structure, you can use something else to solve it. Okay? And usually I think that's that's the kind of sort of interview process that I prefer to see for UI roles. But yeah, and the other thing is I'm just talking about my interview process. I'm not saying everyone at Harness interviews this way, right? So your mileage may vary. Okay, then another question is, can you share links to your performance improvement talks on the resources you use for it? Yeah, definitely. Maybe I can ask Rashmi to share them.
Yeah, so guys, we can share all the links and all the PPTs in the community. So I have already shared the link of joining the community. So we'll just join it, say hi, introduce yourself there, and I'll share all the resources that we have talked about in today's session.
Will map provide performance benefits than object? Like in JavaScript, map and object are not that different. I mean, we don't really have real hash maps in JavaScript. Both maps and objects give you O1 lookups. So there is not a lot of difference. Like if you're implementing something like a weak map or a strong map, then you get the additional benefit that the JavaScript engine will internally dedupe entries for you, depending on what data structure you're using. But I think that's about the only benefit you get. So you don't have to dedupe things yourself. There might be others, but yeah, mostly there are very specific use cases where maps will work. So it's good to know when to use them. But yeah, it's only in those specific cases where you get performance benefits. Just blindly replacing objects with maps will not give you any performance benefits.
Awesome. So I think that was the last question of the session, and that brings us to the end of this wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Abhinav, for answering all the questions that people had. And guys, as I said, if there are, so we planned this session for 1 hour, and we have already exceeded the same by 30 minutes. So, so if you have more questions, please join the community. You will find fellow developers who can answer your question as well. And Abhinav, if it works for you as well, you can also be a part of the community and answer some of the questions that people have. And I'm pretty sure you guys would have had a lot of learning. 35 people are still here, so we would be waiting to see your post on LinkedIn and what all you have learned from today's session. I have shared the link of LinkedIn profile of Abhinav as well in the chat, so you can connect with him, tag him, and tag Recro, and we would love to see all your learnings. So, all right, everyone, that's pretty much it for today's session. Thank you so much once again for joining us. I hope to see you guys in the next session. Till the time, please take care and stay safe. And yeah, see you soon in the next one. Thank you so much, Abhinav, once again for joining us.
Thank you, Rashmi, for giving me this opportunity, and thanks everyone for showing up and for all the wonderful questions. I really hope you all learned something today, at least one useful fact somewhere. And yeah, thank you everyone. It was really nice talking to all of you. Thanks everyone. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or email or via the Recro forum. Anything works. Would be happy to talk more about anything related to UI.
Thank you so much, Abhinav, once again. Thanks guys. Have a good day. Bye.